rebroadcast those events here live at the conference. Yes, it's being recorded. Okay, great. So before we introduce those speakers, I wanted to just give everybody an overview of how the workshop is going to play out as a whole. So in the morning, there will be we'll basically be playing through each of the 3 virtual seminars. So if you didn't have a chance to tune in a couple of weeks ago, we encourage you to stick around so that you can see those talks. We'll be beginning with the developmental seminar, then the artificial intelligence seminar, and closing with the neuroscience one. Each seminar will run approximately an hour. Okay, so if you are among those who did tune in to the live Zoom call a couple of weeks ago, this is gonna be very familiar. So feel free to duck out and come back after lunch. Okay, so we're gonna break from noon to 1 and then begin some of the more hybrid live new material in the afternoon. Okay, so just to recap, in the morning, it'll be a pure rebroadcast of the virtual seminars for those of you interested in viewing those this morning. Then at 1 p.m., we'll have proper opening remarks for today's session, followed by a panel discussion. 5 of our invited speakers were kind enough to join live, albeit remotely, for that discussion, and that'll be chaired by Tim Rogers. Following the panel discussion, we're going to have 2 invited talks, then a rapid fire session with contributed talks, very brief period for a poster session and just general mingling here in this room. And this is not officially part of the workshop, but it's on the schedule anyway. There's going to be a happy hour a couple blocks away. So if you're here in Toronto in person, let's go hang out there. Okay, so this is the location. It's on this slide. But if you don't have a chance to write it down now, we'll be announcing that again at the end of the day. Okay, are there any questions about logistics before diving in from anywhere? All of this information and more is available on our workshop website, images2symbols.github.io. It's linked from Underline and from the CogSci main website, so hopefully that makes it easy to find. Excellent. Well, why don't we go ahead and I'm going to pass the mic to Holly, who will be introducing our invited speakers.
All right. Hi, everyone. I hope you guys can hear me. Again, welcome to our workshop. It's really wonderful to have you guys here. And before we get started with the broadcasted recordings, I just want to give a really big thank you to all of our speakers and chairs who are part of our workshop, and also to intro you guys to them. So part of our developmental seminar, we had Bria Long, who is a research scientist in psychology at Stanford University, as well as Logan Fiorella, who is an assistant professor of educational psychology at the University of Georgia. And our seminar was chaired by Molly Dillon, who is an assistant professor of psychology at New York University. Afterwards, we're going to be hearing from David Ha, who is a research scientist at Google Brain, Kathy Wong, who is a PhD candidate at MIT, as well as Yulia Griaditskaya, who is an assistant professor in artificial intelligence at the University of Surrey. And lastly, we're going to end with Wilma Bainbridge, who is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Chicago, Jeff Wamis, assistant professor of psychology at Queen's University, and Matt Lombon-Ralph, unit director in cognition and brain sciences in the University of Cambridge. So we're all very grateful for all of these speakers and chairs to have joined us just a couple of weeks ago for our workshops. And like Judy said before, please come say hi to us. We are the organizers. You're welcome to come talk to us throughout the workshop, and we'd love to know what your interests are as well with drawing and cognition. So we're going to get started with broadcasting the developmental seminar first. And again, that's going to be Molly Dillon, Bria Long, and Logan Fiorella. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So today I'm going to talk about two recent studies
super
looking
quiet.
at the role of students' motivation and metacognition in learning by drawing. And so most of the prior research on learning by drawing involves learning from science texts. So for instance, we might give students a
Oh, that can't be the actual volume. Hi.
thank you.
Hi, do you?
And thank you all for joining today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So today I'm going to talk about
We're troubleshooting audio. We'll be resuming shortly. So this,
So it's that one. Yeah. Oh, it's on the edge.
okay. Like this.
Oh, that might be. You might have to just play it off with our laptop.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
because the audio does play.
yes.
That
but then
way?
because of the Zoom call, we're gonna get feedback.
Oh, great. Okay. Should I leave the Zoom call and try that?
Yeah.
Would that be better? Okay. Okay. Okay.
Just gotta go to your audio settings.
Audio settings. Okay. Okay.
Output.
Output the decimator.
External headphones.
External headphones
Yeah.
like this. Okay.
And
That works.
full volume.
Full volume. Okay. Let's try that. Okay.
thank you. And thank you all for joining.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. That sounds about right. Okay. Thank you so much. All right. Thanks everybody for bearing with us. That was actually, yay! Okay, thanks for clapping. Yeah, we figured out YouTube for this hybrid conference. This is awesome. Okay, so first up, as Holly said, is Logan Fiorella. I will let him take it away.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So today I'm going to talk about two recent studies looking at the role of students' motivation and metacognition in learning by drawing. And so most of the prior research on learning by drawing involves learning from science texts. So for instance, we might give students a text on the human circulatory system. This is just an excerpt from one of the lessons we use. And then ask students to create their own drawing to represent what's being described in the text. And the idea is that this process of translating between the text into one's own visual representation essentially forces students to organize and integrate the material with their existing knowledge, and that the product that they produce should be some reflection of the quality of the mental model of the circulatory system that they've developed. So my research focuses on how the potential benefits and boundary conditions of using drawing as a learning strategy in this context of learning from science texts. So we know now that there's several studies that show that drawing can support science text comprehension, but not surprisingly, this depends largely on the quality of the drawings that students generate. So how accurately the drawings are depicting the key conceptual relationships. And the research suggests students struggle to do this without receiving extensive instructional support to produce high quality drawings. But another benefit that's received a little bit less attention is a metacognitive one. So the potential for drawing to help students become more aware of their own understanding of the learning material and therefore make more accurate judgments about their learning. So the correspondence between how well they think they understand something and how well they actually perform. And that's something that students typically struggle a lot with. And it depends a lot on the types of cues that students use when they're making their judgments of learning. So in the second study I talk about today, I will look at drawing as a potential strategy to improve metacognitive accuracy. But students are not likely to realize these benefits of drawing if they're not motivated to use drawing as a strategy in the first place. And there's research showing that students typically do not spontaneously choose to draw, even in situations when it would be beneficial to them. So in the first study that I'll talk about now, we'll look at some of the possible reasons why students typically don't choose to draw. So in this first study, we have undergraduates study and take notes on a lesson on the human respiratory system. And we randomly assigned students between subjects to one of four strategy conditions. So the first condition is what we'll call the free choice condition, where they could essentially use any strategy they want to take notes. And so there are 10 parts of the lesson, and for each part, they could take notes however they wanted to. So essentially they have 10 opportunities potentially to draw. Then we have an explicit choice group where we ask students to choose between, okay, you can write a summary in your own words of this part of the lesson, or you can create a drawing of this part of the lesson. So again, they have 10 opportunities to choose to draw or not. We also included two additional conditions that I won't really go into much for this presentation, but we had some students who were explicitly instructed to summarize, or some students who were explicitly instructed to draw for all parts of the lesson. But right now I'm going to focus just on students' choice to draw and the relationship between the frequency at which students choose to draw and their beliefs about drawing, or their motivation to use drawing as a strategy. So the other component of this is we had students complete a series of surveys asking them to report their prior experience using drawing, their confidence using drawing, their perceived value of drawing as a learning strategy, and the perceived cost in terms of the time and effort it takes to use that strategy. And we did this for both drawing and summarizing to compare students' beliefs about each strategy. So when we look at drawing frequency, obviously this only really applies to the first two conditions where students had a choice, so we'll just focus on those. You can see that drawing frequency is very low for the free choice condition. So basically, again, they had 10 opportunities to choose to draw. And only 3% of the time when not prompted to use a particular strategy did they actually try to create a drawing from the text. So that means 97% of the time they're using some sort of verbal strategy like summarizing or making a list or maybe a simple outline. Then when we gave them the explicit choice, they were more likely to draw. So now they're drawing 17% of the time. So that suggests that just being aware that drawing is an option did increase their use of drawing, but it's still only 17% of the time. And that means that 83% of the time they were choosing to summarize. And I should mention that this is a context in which drawing is typically a more effective strategy than summarizing when learning from a science text. So then we look at their beliefs about drawing and how they relate to the beliefs about summarizing. And as you might expect, based off of the first set of results, it's pretty consistent that students don't tend to have very positive or productive beliefs about drawing when compared to summarizing. So in terms of their expectation to be successful using the strategy or their perceived value in terms of their enjoyment or how well they think the strategy is going to help them achieve their goals, it's consistently lower than what students report in terms of the value and their expectations for success using summarizing. And also drawing is perceived as being more costly in terms of the time and effort that it takes to draw. So clearly, students are overwhelmingly preferring summarizing in a context where a lot of times we find that drawing actually is more effective. And then we can look at, these data here are across all participants in the study. Then we look at the correlations between the frequency of drawing and their beliefs about drawing. And this is just among those in the explicit choice condition, because drawing frequency was essentially 0 in the free choice condition. So we're kind of limited in sample size here, but basically the pattern is what you might expect, where it is the case that in the explicit choice group, most students did not choose to draw, but those who did, they tended to have more positive beliefs about drawing, expectancies for success, intrinsic value. And we also asked them about their confidence using drawing and their prior use of drawing, which were pretty strongly associated with more higher drawing frequency. So clearly there seems to be a bit of a motivational barrier to drawing. And it suggests that and this is something that we can probably discuss in the discussion period about how we might encourage students to draw more frequently. So that's kind of the motivational side of this talk. Now to kind of shift over to the metacognitive side and looking at whether drawing can potentially help students become more accurate when making judgments of how well they're going to perform on a test. This is something that students really struggle to do, and drawing might be an effective strategy to help improve their accuracy. So in this study, we had undergraduates this time study 5 texts, so on various biology topics, including the respiratory system, the digestive system, renal system. And the way it worked was all students would study the text and make a judgment of their learning. So they're basically rating how well they think they're going to perform on a subsequent comprehension test for each topic. So they're making 5 judgments of learning. So they do that 5 times. And the students were randomly assigned to one of 4 conditions. So there were students in the first condition who only studied the text without any provided visuals or without drawing. Then we have a second condition where they studied the text with provided visuals, and prior research suggests that provided visuals can actually interfere with metacognitive accuracy sometimes because they can give a bit of an illusion of understanding. They kind of makes it seem like you understand it better than you actually do. And then we have the learner-generated visuals condition, which is essentially the drawing condition. And then a 4th condition, which I'll show you what that looks like on the next slide, but this is a condition where students observed a little animation of the visual being created as if it was drawn by the instructor, but they, of course, weren't actually drawing it to see if the actual learner generation matters in terms of the metacognitive effects of these different visual formats. So after they study the text and make judgments for all 5 texts, then they completed 5 comprehension tests corresponding to the 5 texts. And the main outcome measure that I'm going to focus on for now is what's often referred to as relative accuracy. So essentially the looking at the intra-individual correlations between students' judgments of their learning for each of the 5 texts and their actual performance. So essentially, each individual, there's a correlation for each individual based off of their 5 judgments and their corresponding performance on the comprehension test. So this is essentially getting at how well can students distinguish between the texts that they understood relatively better than others, right? Before I show you the results for relative accuracy, I'll just go through what the visuals look like. This is just one of the topics on the nervous system, one of the provided visuals, just to give you an idea of what it looked like. So obviously this is the structure of a neuron. So that's the provided visual, just a regular static diagram that you might see in a textbook. In the instructor generated visual group, I'll show you what this looks like. It's the exact same visual, but just animated, it kind of sped up, as you can see, as if it was kind of drawn by an instructor. But as you'll see, it produces the exact same visual that you see on the left. So the only difference is you're seeing it being constructed and labeled in real time versus just seeing it statically. You know, there's lots of research showing that when you just show provided visuals, like on the left, students tend to just focus on the text. They don't pay much attention to the visuals, or they process them superficially. And there's some research that seeing the visual being constructed by the instructor can have learning benefits. So we're looking at whether this also translates into metacognitive benefits. And the third visual condition was the learner-generated visual. This is an example student drawing of a neuron, just to give you an idea of what that looked like. So the main result I just want to focus on for this study is obviously relative accuracy. So that's what you're seeing on the y-axis. This is, again, the correlation between their judgments and their actual performance. And obviously higher correlations indicate that they're better at distinguishing between the text that they understood better than the others. So when you look at the 4 groups individually, there's no statistically significant difference across the conditions, with a one-way ANOVA. But obviously you can see a bit of a pattern here where the 2 groups on the left are relatively low in terms of they're having a relative accuracy around 0.2 or so, or under 0.2. That's pretty consistent with prior research suggesting that students are not very accurate when they're making judgments. And the 2 groups on the right are relatively higher, around 0.3, almost 0.4. And when you do kind of group these together, the groups that had the generated visuals versus the groups that either had no visual or provided visual, you do see an overall difference when you just kind of lump them together, that the students who were, regardless of whether they generated visual, but learner generated or instructor generated visuals led to better relative accuracy than the 2 other conditions. And we can talk a little bit in the discussion about why that might be. And it might be for different reasons that the learner generated and instructor generated visuals had that a little bit of a boost for accuracy. So just to kind of wrap up these 2 studies with some of the implications, kind of on the motivational side, it seems pretty clear that students don't tend to draw spontaneously, even when given the explicit choice. So it's not simply a matter of like, students just aren't aware of, or just didn't think about drawing as a strategy, which could be part of the explanation, because they did draw a little more frequently in the explicit choice group. But it seems to be driven more by just differences in the beliefs that students have about drawing, especially compared to more popular strategies like summarizing, as it being less valuable or more costly, and therefore not concluding that it's not really worth the effort to use, even if it is effective strategy. So it suggests that students need more experience and guidance to actually be motivated to want to use drawing more effectively. And we can talk about specific ways of doing that. On the metacognitive side, we found a little bit of evidence that generated visuals, whether they're learner or instructor generated, might have some metacognitive benefits. And it may be encouraging students to make greater use of comprehension-based cues to get them thinking more about their actual understanding of the text, whereas students tend to base their judgments off of very superficial features like characteristics of the learning material, or just beliefs about themselves, kind of general heuristics, but not really valid indicators of their actual understanding. So with that, I'll stop there, but I thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Logan. Folks, if you'd like to either raise your hand or put a question in the chat, I'm gonna, I think, be able to scroll through the attendees with some facility here to recognize hands up. But for the sake of time, since I don't see any hands right now, maybe I can start with a question, Logan, if you don't mind.
Sure.
My question is about the efficacy of drawing in learning. Is it, do you think, is it about the drawing itself, or is it about the belief in the drawing being effective that makes learning happen, right? So the learning can come from the actual content of the drawing, or understanding a particular kind of represented concept, or it can come from the motivation that you think this drawing is going to help you learn, right? Do you have a sense of whether or not, or what the relative contribution is of these two kinds of things? Is the drawing helping you learn, or is your confidence in drawing as a method for learning helping you learn?
Yeah, well, I think it might be a little bit of both, but I think in this talk, I was focusing more on the beliefs about drawing, but in other research, we focus on just the benefits of drawing for learning, or the direct benefits of asking students to draw and their effects on learning outcomes. And there's pretty strong evidence now that drawing can be effective. Just the act of creating a drawing can support comprehension and performance on transfer tests, basically to the extent that students are capable of generating high quality drawings, the drawings that actually depict the key conceptual relationships that are described in the text. And like I said at the beginning, I think is just that students struggle to do that spontaneously. So even when you do prompt students to draw, obviously that's not a guarantee that they're going to be able to accurately translate the text into a drawing. And so they often need a lot of guidance. And so there are different ways you can guide students to draw. I didn't focus on this in this study, but we have in other studies where you can, for instance, give students partially provided drawings, right? Instead of having them have to draw something from scratch, just to kind of scaffold the drawing process, that it increases drawing accuracy, and drawing accuracy turns out to be a pretty good predictor of later performance on comprehension and transfer tests. And you can give students feedback on their drawings, where they generate their own drawing, and then you have them compare their drawing to a provided drawing and then have to revise their drawing. That can be an effective way to improve their drawing accuracy. So there does seem to be a pretty direct connection between the accuracy of their drawing and their subsequent performance on comprehension and transfer tests.
Great, thanks. All right, I think that the first hand I saw was Sharon. Is that right? Sharon, can you want to chime in?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Hi, Logan.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Great. So I was thinking that your second study is quite reminiscent of Jenny Wiley's study that also found that drawing reduced the seductive details kind of effect and increased meta comprehension accuracy. But what she found was that animation increased kind of seductive details effect. So in some sense, your instructor generated drawing is an animation. Right. So I was wondering if there is something specific to the difference between an instructor generated visual, because that looks quite like an animation to me. And then the other thing I was wondering was whether the underlying cognitive account would be different for the benefits of drawing yourself versus instructor generated visuals, or whether you thought they were kind of similar explanations. Sorry, that's far too long a question.
So I think there are a couple of questions in there. One is, I think it is definitely an animation of the visual being constructed, and it is an animation just sped up of an actual illustrator creating the drawing. It's a little bit different than other animations, I guess, used in prior research, because with the drawing, showing the drawing being constructed, the information, once it's put on the screen, it stays there, right? Whereas an animation of like how a system works and how it changes over time, it tends to be transient, right? So you can't, once something changes and it moves into a different position, you can't see it anymore, right? But this is just showing it being presented on the screen, and it's just staying on the screen once it's being presented. So the actual content is not animated, right? It's not like the neuron is moving or firing, showing that kind of movement. It's just the drawing itself, right? So I think that's one difference between this this kind of animation and typical animations that are used. And that is something that we were wondering whether this group would effectively be more like other animations, or would it be more like drawing, where you're seeing the same kind of metacognitive benefits. So obviously it could be the case that you see the animation that we used, and this gives you a sense of fluency and familiarity and makes you feel like you understand it better than you actually do, and it reduces metacognitive accuracy, kind of like Jenny Wiley's research. But in this particular study, I mean, we have to get deeper into what kinds of cues students are using, but it acted more like the learner-generated visual group than we might expect, kind of a typical animation group to act. So, but yeah, this is just a first pass, and we need to, we did ask them about the types of cues that they used in their, to make their judgments. I do have this is very early on data that's very new, so we're still not kind of working through it. I have it somewhere here, where you see, I think you can still see my screen, right? Yeah, so basically the two generated visual groups were more likely to use comprehension-based cues, like talk about, so what went into making your judgment of learning, but more likely to say, oh, I thought about how well I understood the lesson, or I thought about how well I could explain this. They were more likely to include comprehension-based cues than the other two conditions here. But yeah, in terms of the specific mechanisms that might be different between the two conditions, like the learner-generated, instructor-generated, we're not exactly sure yet what might be explaining it. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thanks for that lovely introduction, Molly. Pleasure to be here today, and excited to get to chat with you all about this work, which I'll note is actually also in collaboration with Judy Fan. So this is a real fun opportunity to get to talk with all of you. Okay. If I show you an array of colored pixels in different locations on the screen, you can really easily derive meaning from what you see. Instead of seeing some colored blobs, we see bikes, bunnies, couches, and cups. There's incoming visual input that's transformed and makes contact with a wealth of information that we have about all of these objects and the categories they belong to. And so broadly, my research program aims to understand the representations that allow us to so easily accomplish this feat, to derive meaning from what we see. So in just a quick glance, we all know that these are objects that are big in the real world, things we navigate with or around, whereas these are all objects that are small enough to hold with one hand, objects we use to interact with the world, and these are all animals that are alive. And we can easily make these inferences when the objects are in full color or when they're in black and white. And as some of my prior work has shown, even when they're reduced to these kind of primitive texture and form features and unrecognizable as bikes or bunnies per se. But of course, our knowledge about these objects goes far beyond their animacy and size in the real world. We know that bicycles have wheels, that cups have handles, that rabbits have long ears. And given a label for these objects, we can access our mental representations of them and choose the visual features necessary to convey their identity. At the same time, we know that we weren't born with all of this knowledge. So what is the nature of these representations that allow us to make these inferences? How do we build these visual concepts, this very flexible and generative knowledge about what things look like? Now, the classic view has been that our visual concepts develop in the first few years of life as we learn to pair labels with the images we see. But now there's quite a bit of evidence that both visual recognition and categorization continue to develop well throughout childhood. We know that children become steadily better at discriminating between perceptually similar exemplars of categories, like two pictures of rabbits or birds, at recognizing objects across unusual viewpoints or lighting, at discarding irrelevant features when they're learning about new categories, and at making explicit categorizations based on taxonomy versus irrelevant perceptual features. And so these abilities are maturing gradually as children experience both depicted and real life versions of the objects in their everyday experience. There's also some work from children's drawing that suggests that our representations have a pretty protracted developmental trajectory. For example, older versus younger children seem to include more diagnostic features in their drawings of different people. When they're asked to draw a man, woman, boy, and girl, younger children tend to draw relatively similar, while as older children draw more distinct categories of people. Further, there's evidence that experience with different novel objects changes what children draw. Children tend to draw what they know rather than what they see. So when children are asked, can you copy this drawing of this particular object? They do something different than after they're shown either a photograph or the real life version of this novel object. Afterwards, they include information about the hidden side of this object. However, most of this prior work has really relied on either manual annotations of one category or in a certain age range, making it hard to actually generalize their conclusions. So today I'm going to talk about our work using drawings to examine whether visual concepts actually become more specific throughout childhood, beyond the early preschool years. In other words, we're going to ask whether children also get better at knowing what makes a bird look different from a rabbit. And so to ask this question, I'm going to be using drawings in two ways. First, I'm going to focus on how children produce drawings and ask whether they show an enhanced ability to include diagnostic features of different categories in their drawings. In turn, we would expect effects in visual recognition. If it's really about children's visual concepts becoming more specific, we would expect them to show enhanced sensitivity to these same diagnostic features when recognizing drawings made by other children. So to get us started, we first developed a novel way of collecting digital drawings from children, asking, for example, what about a bird? Can you draw a bird? And here is one child's answer to this question. She's drawing with her hands on this tablet. She draws a beak, eyes, mouth, adds a tail, a couple of legs, and then she's done. So using this method, we installed a freestanding station at the San Jose Children's Discovery Museum, where children came and draw on their own after their children helped them navigate the consent forms. And over 2 years, we collected data from 48 different categories of objects, including prompts for both commonly drawn categories, such as airplanes and trees, as well as really rarely drawn categories, such as scissors, couches, and octopus. And after filtering for off-task drawings where children were just scribbling, we obtained a data set containing more than 37,000 drawings from about 8,000 children between the years of 2 and 10 years of age. And so with this much larger data set from a wide range of ages, we can now assess how children's drawings of common visual concepts actually change across development. But with these data in hand, we need a principled way of analyzing them. And so here we turn to deep CNN activations or deep convolutional neural networks as a tool for analyzing this data set. So there's been quite a bit of work now validating the use of these models for predicting human recognition. So these activations and layers of these networks predict both neural responses to object categories and object responsive cortex, perceptual similarity judgments for novel and familiar categories, category typicality ratings to some extent, and even the correspondence between sketches and photographs of object categories. So these models are a really good proxy for human recognition, and they can allow us to analyze this large data set. So what we're going to do is ask how recognizable these drawings are based on their high-level visual features as extracted by this model, which is called BGG19. This is just one version of a neural network model. So we're going to extract visual feature vectors for every drawing in the data set using this model. It's 4,096 long vector. This happens to be from that second to last network layer, which we know has features that are really good at basic level recognition, that is distinguishing a bird from a dog. Then we're going to try to predict the category labels for a set of held out drawings using these visual feature vectors with a set of logistic regressions. And that's kind of like embedding all of these drawings in a high dimensional feature space. And now for every drawing, these regressions are going to give us two outputs. First, they're going to give us a measure of category classification accuracy. Just was this drawing correctly recognized based on these visual features? It's also going to give us a graded measure of classifier evidence. This is going to be the log odds probability for that category in these logistic regressions. So to what degree did this drawing contain evidence for a given category? So for example, for that drawing of a rabbit, you can ask, to what extent did this rabbit have evidence for the category rabbit or the category bird? So now using these classifications, we can now first ask our very basic question, which is, do drawings just become more recognizable across development? This is what we would expect. Here, I'm going to plot the classification categorization axis on the y-axis and the age of the child drawing on the x-axis. And indeed, we see that drawings increasingly contain the visual features needed for basic level recognition. That is, we see strong age-related gains in the recognizability of children's drawings, supporting the basic prediction that they do increasingly contain these features. Here on these plots, every single dot is a category, one of the 48 categories in the data set. And I'll talk about this item variation in just a minute. Before I do that, I want to note that we see the same effect when we ask adults to recognize a subset of these drawings, when we conduct the same experiment in a controlled setting, or when we use a different classification model. So next, we can use these classifications to ask about more graded changes in children's drawings. We can ask whether recognizable drawings also change across development. That is, some drawings of birds are more recognizable as birds. And another way that we can examine this is if children's recognizable drawings look more recognizable. So we're going to quantify the classifier evidence assigned to the target category. This is, again, the log odds probability by these regressions. And so first, I'm going to show you some drawings that differ on this metric. So here are some red drawings that tend to have very high classifier evidence for the target categories. And as we go down, you can see that these have less evidence for these given categories. So here, our question really is, do older children tend to produce drawings that are more like these red drawings, that even though they're all relatively recognizable, do they tend to be more recognizable, have more evidence for that target category? So now I'm going to be plotting this classifier evidence metric on the y-axis with every category on the x-axis. And each dot is going to be drawings from a given age group from 2 to 10 years, 10 in yellow and 2 in purple. And what we see is that on average, older children's drawings contain more diagnostic features, even within the set of recognizable drawings. So these lighter colored yellow dots tend to be higher than the darker dots on average across all of the categories. Now, one thing you might notice is that there's quite a bit of variation. And so one natural intuition was that, well, maybe the categories that are better recognized are the categories that children are practicing drawing quite a bit. But when we look at these categories, what we see is no intuitive ordering by how frequently they tend to be drawing. So up at the top, we have houses and clocks, but also mushrooms, snails. And towards the least recognized, we have whales, airplanes, and then dogs. And what we see basically is that there's no effect of the frequency with which children tend to draw these different categories. However, these analyses still really leave uncovered what is actually changing about these drawings across development. And so to get at this question, we've started to annotate the visible object parts in each drawing to try to ask, what are these diagnostic features of each category? We've been doing this for a subset of around 2,000 drawings in 16 of the categories, and have at least 3 annotators per drawing come and assign each stroke that children made to a different object part. So here on this bird drawing that we saw earlier, you can see the tail is purple, the body is green, the beak is a lighter blue. We now start to have a sense of what object parts actually appeared in these drawings over development. And to give you a sense of what these look like, I can just show you some of the drawings. Now they're increasing the number of unique object parts. You can start to see that this might track a bit with recognition, but they get a little bit more recognizable as you include more recognizable object parts. And we can start to ask how these parts are changing across development. Now, one intuition here is that you might see one really important object part for each category popping out, say ears for rabbits. Contrary to this intuition, we see that it seems to be really the combination of many different object parts that are changing across development. So on the y-axis, we have the proportion of drawings in a given age group that had a certain part. On the x-axis for each category is the age of the child that was drawing. And in general, we see some intuitive things, like for cars, they tend to have more wheels as children get older. But in general, it's not so straightforward. So it's really the changes in the inclusion and emphasis of many different parts, and probably their spatial arrangement within those drawings that lead to them being more recognizable across development. At the same time, the poorly classified drawings don't seem meaningless. And in fact, quantitatively, we found this to be the case. So we can look at the probabilities assigned to the predicted categories for each of our target categories and find some really systematic confusions. So octopuses are often confused with spiders, faces confused with clocks, phones are confused with books and bottles, beds are confused with panel, house, and chair. And indeed, when we look at these misclassified drawings that were poorly recognized, we can still decode the animacy of the category children were trying to draw. So if we look among animals or inanimate objects, we can still tell what animacy they were trying to draw. So here are some example drawings where we couldn't tell which animal they were trying to draw, but could still tell that it was an animal. And same thing with objects. And in fact, even within inanimate objects, we can decode the intended real world size of the category they were intending to draw. So here are some example big object drawings that were not recognizable as a particular category per se, but could still be decoded as big in the real world. And this is consistent with some of my prior work showing that curvature, so the amount of boxiness versus curviness in big versus small objects, is a good feature to that category. So far I've showed you evidence that children's features in their drawings change across childhood. So when children are asked to draw a rabbit, children gradually include more diagnostic features via recognizable object parts in their drawings. So now we need to turn to visual recognition and ask whether they show enhanced sensitivity to these diagnostic features. So to do so, we designed a guessing game at the same museum kiosk where children were presented with drawings one at a time and had to tap on which visual concept each went with from a set of 4 options. So using 4 different versions of this guessing game, we collected recognition data for 16 classes for around 1,700 participants. And to make this task sufficiently challenging, options in each guessing game are all relatively similar. So these are all small animals, for example. In another game, they were all vehicles. And we also have these catch trials to make sure children are actually on task during the experiment. Now, we sampled drawings randomly from the larger data set. And so as a result, they varied in how recognizable they were, and of course, in the degree to which they contain diagnostic features. So here is a set of rabbit drawings that vary in the amount of diagnostic features that they have. And our critical question is whether children's sensitivity to these diagnostic features changes across development. So first, I'm going to just show you the recognition data collapsing over all levels of diagnostic features. So on the y-axis is proportion of drawings recognized. On the x-axis is the age of the child that was doing the recognizing, where each dot is one child. And we see consistent gains in how well children are able to recognize each other's drawings. So now our critical question is whether older children are differentially sensitive to increasing levels of diagnostic information. So I'm going to replot the same data, separating out recognition data for each age and as a function of the diagnostic visual features in the drawings. And here we see an interaction between these 2 factors. So we see that for higher levels of diagnostic visual information, older children are better able to capitalize on this information in the drawings. They're more sensitive to the diagnostic visual information that they see. Because these same drawings were annotated for part information, we can also look at how children's sensitivity to part information changes across childhood. So on the x-axis, we now have the number of unique object parts. On the y-axis, we have the proportion of drawings that are recognized. And here again, we're looking for an interaction between age and the amount of visual information in the drawings. And again, we see this same change in slope across age. We see that older children are more sensitive to increasing object part information. And you might also notice that sometimes when drawings seem to have a lot of object parts, they may be a little bit less well recognized. And happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. So today I've showed you some evidence that children's visual concepts become more specific throughout childhood. Children gradually included more diagnostic features via recognizable object parts in their drawings. Yet their unrecognizable drawings weren't completely meaningless. At the same time, older children were better able to use diagnostic part information during recognition, and we saw evidence from this both using object part annotations as well as the diagnostic feature metrics. So how might this be happening? How are children becoming better at connecting their internal and external representations of visual concepts? One idea is that they're practiced visual communicators. They're becoming better able to know which visual features their peers are going to be sensitive to during the process of recognition. Another idea is that they're just learning more about the world. They're learning that mammals include whales, which have to live underwater. And so they might include different features when they're drawing different animals or objects across development as they learn about them. Finally, as they get older, they're seeing more and more exemplars of different categories. They have more extensive categorization experience, and all 3 of these factors might be enriching their visual concepts. And so I think that by trying to understand how visual concepts are built and how they change across childhood, we can start to make both theoretical and computational progress on understanding how it is we learn to derive meaning from what we see. With that, I'd like to thank all of you for coming, advisors, collaborators, funding sources, and also point out our poster at CogSci coming up, which really goes into detail on the drawing changes in the semantic part structure of drawn objects. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bria. I will keep my eye on hands in the Zoom, but I'll also start off with a question to get us rolling. So how specific is your neural network classification to neural nets versus kids, for example, or people? So did you compare the kids classification or identification of the different objects to how the neural net performed? And in particular, I'm asking this question because maybe dogs and cats just have fewer discriminating features, right? So they're hard to classify not only for the neural net, but also for people. And so the ordering may have to do with the relative sort of discriminating features of the different objects that you were tested. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And I think it's to one of the more recent analyses we've been doing that didn't make it into the talk. So I think to some extent that ordering is really, really dependent on that set of 48 categories. So if you have house, fish, dog, and zebra, for example, that's going to be a much easier classification task than this 48-way classification task, where there's a lot of small animals that are actually pretty hard to distinguish from each other. Like drawing a dog, rabbit, and cat is a pretty hard task. That being said, these models aren't perfect mirrors of human recognition. We do see a correlation between this model and kids recognition in terms of which categories are better or worse recognized. We see a slightly stronger correlation between a more state-of-the-art model of recognition. This is contrastive language image pairing models, the CLIP models from OpenAI, that are kind of less susceptible to item effects. So, they tended to be a slightly better model of children's recognition. But overall, yes, there's a correlation between these two. And I think it has to do with the fact that there are, certain categories that have less distinctive features relative to the other categories in the set.
Great, thanks. Other questions for Bria? Claire, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, I think this is sort of maybe a couple questions in one, so sorry if they're a little muddled, but so I'm wondering about your sort of like, the idea that kids are becoming better visual communicators. And there's sort of like at least two aspects there, one of which is sort of like reasoning about the communication bit, and then another is like learning the conventions of visual communication specifically, and sort of how people draw and whatever. So I'm wondering about like those two aspects, like what you think is contributing there. You've got like kids maybe starting to reason about like, well, this other kid wouldn't have drawn this way if they wanted to convey to me that this was a rabbit or something. And maybe that differs by like, if you were told, oh, the kid who drew this was a 3-year-old versus like a 6-year-old, you might like make a different decision. And then on the other hand, you have sort of like, oh, well, I know that, cartoons tend to really exaggerate like rabbit ears and duck bills and whatever and so on. So yeah, I'm wondering about those two factors and what you're thinking about the balance there.
Yeah, you're totally right that in that slide I kind of lumped both of those together. So there's probably learning about conventions, and there's also kind of children's ability to reason about the minds of others that's also changing during this very large developmental age range. So let me tell you about a couple of things that we are thinking about. So one thing that we did was in an experimental version of this, we actually told children that other children were going to recognize their drawings. So we were like, hey, you're going to play this drawing game. Someone else is going to try to recognize these drawings. So like try to draw really so that other kids can recognize what you're drawing. And we still see kind of the same overall patterns. Now, it might be the case that younger children just have a harder time simulating someone else's mind. Like that's just it's a hard task that develops over childhood. And so even if you try to equalize that across age groups, that's just going to kind of be impossible. That's one of those things that's changing. And so I do think that that is part and parcel of some of the developmental changes that we're seeing here, is children's ability to reason about what someone else is going to see when they're drawing. There's a separate piece about learning conventions that I think is really interesting and related to some of the discussions about item effects. So some categories have really clear, like iconic representations, like, birds you can draw like this. You can even like maybe see what I'm drawing. Fish you can draw like this. You might know that as well. And that's really different than say a couch or scissors. Like you probably don't have an internalized representation of that. And so that's part of the reason that we got so many different categories that really span this dimension, to make sure that we weren't just picking up on, learning about iconic representations. We haven't seen like a really strong pattern in our data where like all the iconic ones are showing, better recognition. So, to TBD on what that difference is across development and when it's learned. So yeah, those are some kind of unstructured thought about this, but I think you're totally right that there's both of those factors are changing across development.
I think we have in the chat, Aaron had a similar kind of question. Aaron, do you want to chime in, or are you good? Have you gotten your question answered?
I guess I've had my question answered. I guess maybe it's asking a slightly different thing about 3D reasoning versus learning symbols.
Could you say just a bit more what you mean by 3D reasoning?
Well, when you draw a picture, you could either be drawing the symbols as was discussed, or you could be thinking about what are the curves and the shapes that represent the actual 3D object that you're drawing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, something that we've thought about a bit as well. And one way that we've tried to get at this is by asking children to draw actual pictures of all of the categories. So we have an experiment within subjects, the same children are asked to draw, can you draw this cat as it looks in the picture versus just, can you draw a cat? Now they draw different categories, so they're not actually ever drawing the same category in both conditions, but across kids, we have both categories in each condition. And somewhat surprisingly, we didn't see any effects in just the overall recognizability of these drawings. If you look at them, like you can start to see ways in which they look different between those two conditions, or you can maybe convince yourself. We are currently doing annotations of all the strokes in those drawings to try to kind of pull apart how they might actually differ on a more fine grain level. But just in terms of recognition, those two tasks don't seem to be that different across development.
Thanks. Okay, Sharon has another question.
I found a camera this time. Hi, thank you. Sorry, I love drawing studies, so sorry for so many questions. So one of the things that I was really struck by was the fact that when you see dyads communicating by drawing, they move in a direction opposed to the developmental changes. So the more interactions we have between people when they draw to communicate, like playing Pictionary, the more abstract and less specific their drawings become. So that seems really interesting to me. So developmentally, we seem to be able to become more specific as we get older. But some of the arguments around communication and around the fact that why we've evolved written symbols and no longer just draw pictures for each other is from the benefits of abstractions and moving away from specificity. So A, I really liked the technique, and B, I need to think about what that means. And if you have a shortcut to what that means, that would be really lovely. And then I wouldn't have to think about it.
Oh, yeah. So I think that's a really interesting observation. Let me say a bit more about what I think specificity means. So I think to me, what this means is that children are getting better at including the features that set a category apart from other categories. So for instance, with rabbits, that is probably something like, long ears relative to a head size that are parallel to each other. That's actually kind of hard to get out from any of the metrics that we've used. And so sometimes you see drawings by older kids where they just draw the ears. Like they're like, whatever, I don't need a head, I don't need whiskers or any of this. I've got the most efficient feature. And actually that is what I would think of as a diagnostic feature. Like, oh, none of the other categories have that. That's all you needed to do. And a lot of times, some of the younger kids' drawings, they have they try to draw like a little furry patch and ears and arms, but they haven't included this more diagnostic feature. So what I mean by specificity isn't actually increasing detail in the drawings. What I mean by that is more diagnostic features that help make the categories less confused with one another, more specific to that category, if that makes sense.
It does. And then that is absolutely consistent with the dyadic communication literature, that you abstract away to the feature that is most salient if you're allowed interaction. But if you don't, if you just draw, it stays concrete, it stays complete. So yes, it's a different terminology. And now I understand it, but it's the same process. And it might be one of the reasons why development moves in the way it moves.
Yeah, I do think so. That's kind of, dovetails to Claire's earlier point that I think is, really important, that this is something that's really changing across childhood, is that we're not using drawings just for ourselves. I have seen kids argue about what goes in a drawing kind of in pilot experiments. They're like, can you draw a cup? They draw a cup, and then another kid comes by and I'm like, your cup needs a handle. And he's like, my cup doesn't have handles. And, they go back and forth. And so I do think that this probably actually happens like in real life, and that kids maybe like thinking about what things are relevant for communicating with other kids and with other adults. And then they're consuming lots of media, right, with depictions too, where they're saying, I had a long conversation with my daughter who is almost 3 about this dog, which she really thought was a rabbit. It's the Blue's Clues dog. I don't know if people know it, but it's got really floppy ears. And she was like, this is not a dog. I don't like this dog. It's not a dog. And so I think this process of talking about what things are is probably part and parcel of how children are learning.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. I think now, organizers, correct me if I'm wrong, I think I have some autonomy in doing the time. Okay, great. So I'm going to proceed with more discussion. And the first thing I want to do is go back to the folks who had questions for Logan. And then I'd like to kind of try to tie it all together with maybe one large question that both of our speakers can talk about, and then we'll go into the breakout sessions. That sounds like a plan. Okay, great. All right, so Wilma and Bria had questions for Logan. Wilma, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. For Logan, my question was what you thought the influence of culture might be on people's hesitation to draw. So maybe like if you ran this in the US, or I guess if you ran this in the US, then maybe like American college students just really don't like drawing. But if you went to another country, maybe you'd find big differences. I'm curious what you think about the impact of culture.
Oh, I was muted, of course. I do think that that's a very interesting question. I don't know. I think to the extent that different cultures emphasize the use of drawing in instruction, I would expect that to play a role in terms of students' beliefs about drawing and their confidence using it. So, just based off of our study with obviously American students, students generally they don't have a lot of experience drawing. That they're not confident drawing, they don't see it as valuable. I think in cultures that might emphasize that more, you might see that this is just a more commonly used strategy, just because it's seen as just another strategy, like summarizing it. They're more comfortable using it. So it'd be really interesting to look at potential cultural differences, to the extent that it's just part of the culture is to draw. And at least from our studies with the participants we've used, it doesn't seem to be a big part of what their educational history up to this point. Yeah, great question.
Thanks.
Thanks, Wilma. Bria, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Thanks for the great talk, Logan. I was wondering, or just hoping to hear your thoughts on the generality of your findings, maybe across ages and across topics. So these are obviously relatively older kids than the ones that I'm used to studying. And so I was kind of, with pretty advanced scientific topics, I was hoping maybe you could tell us a little bit about kind of the scope of the findings that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of the research so far with drawing has been in the context of science and with relatively older students, high school and college level. I think there's, and usually with materials that obviously kind of lend themselves toward drawing, or at least, we use topics like the respiratory system, the circulatory system. These are physical, organ systems that, emphasize structure, function, relationships. It seems that drawing is pretty appropriate for those types of contexts. As far as age, there's fewer studies with younger children looking at, effects of drawing on learning. And I think there's some evidence that younger children struggle a little bit more to draw, and they might need a little bit more guidance. I mean, even college students need a lot of guidance. So it kind of just depends on the prior knowledge, the domain specific prior knowledge of the individuals. So whether you're college level or at a younger level, and then also the amount of guidance that instructors provide. So simply giving a generic prompt to draw is not likely to be super effective either at any age, really, unless the student has a lot of background knowledge and can do it effectively without support. But generally speaking, giving, modeling how to draw in that discipline, in that particular context, or giving some sort of scaffolding, like I said, like partially provided drawings and giving feedback and having opportunities to revise their drawings. Those are all things that would probably benefit younger children with drawing more effectively, but also just anyone with less background knowledge.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to open up the discussion a bit and discuss what has sort of come up in a response to Bria's question, or Bria's talk in the question section about communication, but I want to talk in particular about the relation between drawing and language. So Logan suggests that learners see drawing as less valuable than, for example, providing verbal summaries when learning a particular concept. And Bria suggests, as I understand it, the verbal labels for objects allow us to swiftly access mental representations of the name to concept, accessing visual features descriptive of the name category, and that drawing can afford the same opportunity. So Logan and Bria, what do you see as critical differences in the way that conceptual knowledge is harnessed or expressed, communicated through language versus drawing? And how do you think the particular communicative aims of each type of medium might affect the expressivity? Logan, you want to jump in first? I see you're unmuted, so we're calling on you.
Yeah, it's a really good question, fundamental question. Yeah, so I mean, I see the relationship, most of my research is on the world of multimedia learning. So learning from combination of words and visuals, based generically speaking, and whether those are provided by the instructor or generated by the student, and kind of see verbal and visual representations as having kind of complementary functions. And that kind of support each other. So we have, I'll give you just an example of a study that we did that kind of illustrates this, is where when we ask students to generate drawings while they're simultaneously explaining something, like to another, to trying to teach somebody something, they generated higher quality explanations than if they were not drawing while they're explaining. And in particular, it helped them generate more inferences in their explanations and elaborate more on their explanations, suggesting that the visual representation kind of serves as a scaffold for sense making, for more of a for the explanation side of things. So like both pieces sort of work together in that clearly visual representations can have the benefit of providing kind of explicit structure. They can show the organization of the concepts, of the structural relationships explicitly, whereas obviously language or explanation basis is typically a little more abstract, or at least allows for more abstraction or generalization. So I think I kind of see them as having complementary functions where, in visualizing strategies kind of support explaining strategies, and together is what allows us to develop kind of a coherent mental representation or mental model. In my case, when we're talking about learning how, scientific systems work, circulatory system, respiratory system, things like that.
That's out of these drawings anyway.
All right. Thank you, everyone. That was our first seminar. We're going to take a short 5-minute break, and then we'll begin the AI seminar broadcast with speakers Kathy Wong and David Ha. Oh, yeah, that's a good thing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I just uploaded for Yale. Yeah. I'll hold on.
Yeah.